This is a University of Otago podcast.
Good evening. My name is Harlene Hain, and I'm the Vice Chancellor here at the University of Otago, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to this inaugural Professorial lecture for Professor Dirk De Ridder. I am very, very happy to see both staff and students here, and also I would like to welcome Dirk's family and his friends and members of the general public who have come to join us this evening. I think what's particularly interesting is that I do have a guest list of people who RSVP'd for this particular event, and I think it's important for the rest of the audience to know that there are also people in this audience who have actually suffered brain injury, for whom this particular appointment was particularly poignant. And I think the last time we had patients in the audience of an inaugural professorial was the lecture that was given by Professor John McCall. And so I think it reminds us that when we make these kinds of appointments, we are not only hiring professors for the university, but we are also hiring very, very talented clinicians. Now, I often say at these lectures that all professors are special, as they are, but each one of them has something that is particularly special about them. And I think the thing that is particularly special about tonight's speaker is that we often refer to him as the people's professor. Because as you know, the fact that Dirk is here is a direct reflection of the efforts of people in Otago and Southland to raise the funds that support this particular chair. So no pressure, Dirk, but the entire South Island really was behind this particular initiative. Now, I was the Vice Chancellor when we started looking for our new Professor of Neurosurgery, and I must say that there are few things that are more daunting as a Vice Chancellor than trying to appoint a medically qualified academic. The only thing more daunting is trying to appoint a neurosurgeon. So I was a little concerned about how this was going to work, but from the moment that we met Dirk, we knew that he was our choice for this particular position. Not only was he incredibly well qualified as both an academic and a clinician, he was also an amazing human being as well. So I warmly welcome him to the University of Otago. I think we are all, both as a university community and a larger community, incredibly lucky that he has chosen to make Dunedin his home. I will now hand over to Associate Professor Jim Reed, who will tell us a little bit more about the academic background of our speaker this evening.
Thank you, Harlene. It's my privilege to be able to introduce Dirk to the audience tonight. I will just run through some of his curriculum vitae and talk a little bit about what he is going to say. Dirk was born in Ghent. I won't tell you what year. He was born in Ghent in Belgium, and if anyone has ever been to Ghent, it's an incredibly beautiful city. So I think you're very privileged to have come from there. His primary education, of course, was also in Ghent, but he had a couple of years in the United States, in Albuquerque, and attended the Santa Fe High School in New Mexico. I have the privilege of looking at his student record, and it runs just something like this. I won't tell you the year again, but the first year was distinction, the second year was distinction, the third year was distinction, the fourth year was distinction, the fifth year was great distinction, the sixth year was distinction, and so on until it ended up finally with another great distinction. His internship was again in University Hospital in Ghent, and then he spent a time in Rwanda as an intern there before coming back to train in neurosurgery. His training was, of course, in Belgium, but he also spent 2 years in South Africa in Durban. He now is the Neurological Foundation Chair of Neurosurgery, as Professor Hain has said. His talk tonight is going to be, he's called it, "To Dream is to Cure Phantoms." And I'm sure, having heard him speak before, not on this subject, of course, but I'm sure it's going to be very interesting. He's going to talk about phantom sound, which is called tinnitus, and phantom pain, and to build a story by stating that in a dream state, in which there is still consciousness, and you will probably all be aware of this, you are sometimes conscious and are dreaming, people don't perceive tinnitus, and they don't perceive phantom pain. So I'm not going to talk about the rest of his lecture. I'm going to let him tell you that himself. So it's with great pleasure that I would like to introduce to you the Neurological Foundation of Neurosurgery, University of Otago, Dunedin, New Zealand. Professor De Ridder.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everybody. Good evening. I will talk to you about dreams. Everybody who starts needs a dream to live up to, hopefully. And my research has basically been focusing on phantoms, phantom perceptions, phantom sound, and phantom pain. Now, when you look at the dictionary or Wikipedia, you will see that dreams are just a succession of images, ideas, emotions, and sensations that occur, and this is important, involuntary in the mind during certain stages of sleep. Now, there's different kinds of dreams, and dreams have been explained in different ways. You've got the prophetic dreams, of which I won't speak, the creative dreams, which are, from a scientific point of view, more interesting, symbolic dreams, which I will not address either, and visionary dreams, which are important for every university and for every academic. Now, actually, science, or the scientific method, was the result of a dream. I'm not going back to Bacon, but when Descartes started his describing the scientific method in his book Des Cours de la Méthode, what he was actually referring to was what he had dreamed more than 10 years before. So a dream is what caused scientific method, which ultimately resulted in what we do on a daily basis. And Kekule is probably the most famous story of where a dream influenced science. And he was dreaming about a snake who was eating his tail, and that gave him the idea of the benzene structure. And actually afterwards, which is also important for science, he mentioned, let us learn to dream, and then we may perhaps find the truth. So dreams are important from a scientific point of view, and are important as well to hopefully develop treatments for phantoms. Now, apart from those creative dreams, you've got visionary dreams. And those visionary dreams, probably the most well-known is Martin Luther King's dream, where he started his, or halfway his talk, he mentioned, I have a dream that one day, and so on and so forth. So where he shows that he has a dream of a new nation. And so the visionary dreams are also important in developing a research plan for the future. Now, those visionary dreams are old, and the alchemist's dream was to turn metal into gold, where we all think, well, alchemy is not science. Well, I'm not so sure about that, or it could become science. And actually, Seaborg, who received the Nobel Prize in 1951 for chemistry, was capable of turning bismuth into gold after a nuclear collision experiment, where bismuth was collided with neutrons, and then actually some gold came off. So might be a dream, but it has been done not too long ago. So if we can turn bismuth into gold, then there should not be a limit to what we should dream about for trying to treat phantoms. And most good ideas come from the patients. The patients tell you what you have to start researching. And I had one patient who told me, look, it's strange, whenever I dream and I wake up afterwards, I remember that I did not suffer tinnitus during my dream. So we systematically started asking patients this question, and we were surprised to see that actually almost nobody had tinnitus or the phantom sound percept during their dream state. And then we looked at the literature and were surprised to find that also phantom limb pain is rare in the dream state. So, which means that if we understand the dream state better, and if we understand what's different in the brain while you're awake or while you're asleep, while you're dreaming, or the difference between dreaming and non-dreaming and while you're asleep, it might actually help us and try to find a solution for phantom sound. And what is interesting is we've been implanting electrodes in the brain in order to attempt to try to suppress tinnitus, is that if you look where we put the electrodes, they're at the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the anterior cingulate, the amygdala, and the parahippocampal gyrus, which should be good, but there are still some missing spots on these lists. But it's surprising that all the spots that we targeted, which were actually based on on our concept of what generates tinnitus, and these are two models, that what we think might be the generators of tinnitus do overlap with those differences that you have when you're dreaming in comparison to when you're awake. Now, if we start off by saying we dream, then we know our brains create the dreams. Tinnitus initially was considered an ear problem and has evolved slowly to a brain problem where the brain does something with missing information if you have hearing loss. But if you really go back fundamentally, you can ask the question, why ultimately do we have a brain? And if you look at this drawing from Haeckel, then there is a story in Rodolfo Llina's book, Eye of the Vortex, and Rodolfo Llina is a neurologist at NYU in New York and also a zoologist. He describes the story of the sea skirt. The sea skirt is a very interesting little creature. In its larval stadium, it swims around, and it has a notochord and a central ganglion. Basically, it has a spinal cord and a kind of a brain, a primitive form of brain, swims around, and at a certain moment, it finds a rock. And when it finds this rock, it just goes and sits on the rock, and it won't move. And at that stage, as Rodolfo describes in his book, it digests its own brain. So it gets rid of its nervous system. And based on that, he proposes that when we start moving around as multicellular creatures, that's when we need a brain. And we need a brain because when you move around, the environment changes a lot more than when you're just sitting on one spot. Now, if you start moving around, there is inherent uncertainty in the environment. Is there a dangerous creature behind the corner? Is there food behind the corner, etc.? So this change in the environment should be predictable, because if it's completely random, if there is no way that you could predict, if there is no statistical regularities in the environment, you don't need a brain because you won't be able to predict. And this is ultimately an adaptation in order to increase our survival. So from a practical point of view, a brain is only necessary as a prediction machine, which is essential once you start navigating around in the environment. The brain uses information from previous experiences, so you need a memory in order to be able to predict future events. And the information has to mean something to you. It has to be related to yourself, because if you don't relate anything yourself, then it doesn't have any meaning. And ultimately, the goal is to reduce the inherent uncertainty, which is inherently present in the environment, and this is, of course, important for your survival. So if you look at these two pictures, actually it's important that when you encounter this, that you learn something from that in the future you don't go and swim at the same spot. And this is why we have a brain. Now, this is a nice story, but do we have any arguments that support this point of view of a brain? Well, it's interesting that if you look at networks in the brain, that the network which is involved in self-perception, so the network in your brain that tells you, I am who I am Dirk, and that it is the same as the default mode. And the default mode is the mode in your brain that's active when you're just sitting, doing nothing really. In the morning when you wake up, the first thing that activates is your default mode, which seems to be the same thing as your self-perception mode, which makes sense because that means that you're ready to start engaging with the environment and to start processing information that comes from the environment. But if you're not doing anything, then you don't need a brain because the environment will not change. So it's important once you start navigating, which also means that when you're older, don't stay in bed, start moving around, because otherwise your brain might disappear like the sea skirt. So if you navigate in the environment, then you need to predict what's coming next. And the network that's involved in prediction actually overlaps with the same network that controls navigation and that controls the default mode and that is involved in self-perception. So there is one network or multiple networks that really overlap. So the concept in itself does make sense, which means that we have to start looking at the brain in a different way. And everybody knows Michelangelo's Pieta in Rome. And in Belgium, we've got what I call the Belgian Michelangelo, Jan Fabre. He created a piece of art, also called a Pieta, where he's lying on Maria's lap and Maria does look different, and Jesus looks more like Jan Fabre. But what is important is that in his hand he holds a brain. It's a new way of looking at the brain. That's what we need. Because the old vision of how the brain works was basically you've got external stimuli, they come into your brain does something with it, and you respond with an autonomic and a motor response. Now, there is another way of looking at the brain, which starts from intention. The idea is that that your brain doesn't do anything except for when it's necessary. Now, then your brain starts working when there is a goal, when there is an intention. And when there is an intention, that's when you're going to predict external stimuli. If your blood sodium level changes, then that will tell your brain go and look for water in order to try and balance that, or go and look for sodium if that's possible. And so you will sample the environment for what the intention tells you that you have to do. And then what the symptoms that you sample will be compared to what you've predicted that will be in the environment. It will be updated in a Bayesian way. You will perceive it, and then you will get your motor response. So on the old view is basically your brain is behavioralistically relatively passive, or perception is passive, whereas the other is an active way of perception, and it's crucially linked to prediction. Now, the old view actually goes back philosophically to Plato and was Christianized by St. Augustine, and then brought into neuroscience by Descartes. And so the tradition, the neuroscientific tradition, actually all the way close to the year 2000 was looking at the brain more or less in this way. Now, there is an old tradition as well, which goes back to Aristotle, who was Plato's student, and he disagreed with almost everything that Plato mentioned, as a good student should do. And his ideas were Christianized by Thomas Aquinas and are now actually getting into neuroscience. The active way of perceiving is probably a little bit like Napoleon's approach to politics, where he said, on s'engage et puis on voit. We act and then we'll see what comes out of it. Or, which is similar to what William James, the famous psychologist, said, action precedes perception. Now, why would this active perception be important? Well, there's a very simple experiment that was done in the 60s by Gibson, where he put 6 cookie forms on the hand. And passively, he just put the cookie form on the hand, and statistically, well, you had about 16%, 1 in 6 chance that that would be correct. And what he saw is that actually only 30% of them were correctly recognized. Whereas if people were allowed to actively explore the cookie form, almost all of them were correctly recognized, which means that active exploration yields a better perceptive result of what the environment really looks like. Now, you can say that's good for touch, but is there something else? Well, if we go back to Aristotle, Aristotle already said that vision is actually nothing more than visual palpation. Just like you're allowed to touch the cookie forms, vision does the same thing. And in the 60s, Yarbus did an experiment with the beautiful statue of Nefertiti, where he showed that when you look at the statue, you're actually exploring it actively with eye movements. Which is interesting, because if something is not moving in the environment, it's fixed. After 80 milliseconds, you won't see it anymore because you will habituate. Except if the environment doesn't move, your eyes will move. And so the movement of your eyes will compensate for the lack of movement in the environment, and you will be able to see it even though it doesn't move. So we predict because there is a change going on in the environment. And in order to predict, the brain uses information which is stored in memory to imagine and simulate and what might come next. So from that point of view, what we perceive is not what is there. It is what is constructed, determined by your previous experiences and based on the expectations that you have, what you're going to see, which fits with the philosophy of Merleau-Ponty. And actually already in the 40s, there was an experiment which was done by Brunner and Postman, where you just have to look at cards that are being shown and then just say whether these cards are normal or whether there is something wrong with what you see. And so when you look at these cards, you can play it slowly or fast. And for some people, you can play it extremely slowly and they say, yep, all looks fine. Other people, you play it fast and they will see it. So I'll play it once more, but what should be seen by some people is that some of the colors of the cards are wrong. So, and if, like this one, so if the color is wrong, most of the people actually don't see that. And there is another experiment which has been done more recently, and that is, if you look at this text, most people will be able to read it. Now, if you passively perceive it, you won't be able to make anything out of it. If you're actively going to predict based on what you expect to read, then that will allow you to understand what is there. Which is interesting from a philosophical point of view, because it means that the wrong information is better than no information. Which also means, if you go philosophically one step further, that, like Nietzsche said, the truth is actually nothing more than an invention of fixed conventions for merely practical purposes. Or in the way of Schiller, the truth is that what works. So our brain doesn't really care whether something is true or not, as long as it's workable, as long as it can have the information to use for the next step to go, that is important, which also might be linked to phantom percepts. Now, Merleau-Ponty, he built his whole philosophy about that, and he said, well, an object of perception cannot be seen in isolation because it's embedded in a context. And it's the context which gives it meaning. For example, if you look at these two little red dots, actually, this dot looks bigger than this dot, even though they're equally big. But the context, the environment is different. So the small dots make this look bigger, which is important because you can have the same experiment which has been done where somebody who uses a cold object and touches in a very cold environment, the person, and that is felt as unpleasant, whereas a hot object in the same environment is felt as pleasant. And the opposite, when you're in a warm environment, coolness is pleasurable, even though it's the same kind of stimulus, it's just the context that changes. And of course, you can also have that in other circumstances. For example, some people enjoy pain when they, in a very specific context, but if they hit their finger with a hammer, a different context, they won't find that pleasurable at all. Now, a brain has evolved throughout history, and now we have an astonishing amount of brain cells. Actually, we've got about 23 billion neurons for men and 19 million for women, which is 4 billion cells different. So even though men have 4 billion more cells, the IQ is the same, which might be interesting, but it also means that there is something else that has to encode intelligence. It means that, and the other thing that might be important is actually the connections, how these cells are connected to each other. And this is for another reason important, because we lose a certain amount of cells during our lifetime, and if we don't compensate by making more connections, well, probably after the end of the lecture, you would be not as intelligent as before the lecture. So this means that we also have to look at the brain in a different way, and an important way of looking at brains from this point of view is that we look at connections rather than just areas that are activated. Now, you can look at the structure, the highways that are present in the brain, and for example here you see most of the streets, if you want to call it like that, in our brain, and on the top you just see the highways that our brain uses, and we can use this information if we do surgery, so we can try and not damage at least the highways in the brain. Now, apart from the structure, there is also functional connectivity, and that looks at how parts of the brain work together or work in opposition. And this is genetically encoded for and changes constantly. For example, on the top you see the functional connectivity here when you do a task for the first time, and the same task done 3 times will already reduce dramatically the amount of brain areas that are involved in the same task. And then the last kind of connectivity is effective connectivity, which looks at from where to where does the information flow. So it doesn't look at only at which areas are involved, but from where to where does the information flow. So we have to start looking at the brain from this point of view. Now, there is an interesting story where Thomas Malthus, who was an economist, wrote a book, and both Wallace and Darwin, when they read it, they invented the theory of natural selection. So they based their theory on economy, which is somewhat strange, except if you approach it from complex adaptive systems. And complex adaptive systems are any system, economy, internet, the brain, that is fulfills two criteria. One is that the structure has a small world topology, and the other one is the presence of noise. And noise can be seen as variability, a form of uncertainty. So, and the brain is a scale-free hierarchical network which has a small world topology. Basically what it means is you've got two extremes. On the one extreme, you've got a completely random brain where every part of the brain is randomly connected to any other part, which is probably not very efficient because you don't know what's going to happen next. The other extreme is where the brain is built in a very regular way like a computer and it can't adapt, which is also not very good because if you always do the same thing on the same situation, you become extremely predictable and you won't survive for a long time. So the brain needs a structure and a function in between both. And that's where the small world topology comes in, and that is especially important if you want to adjust to changes in the environment. Now, the environment itself has a structure of pink noise, which is not in itself that important, but what is interesting is that the brain actually has developed a function which follows those same statistical regularities. It also functions with a function of pink noise. So, and that pink noise is actually what allows you to permit variability. Because if it's completely random, it would be white noise. So this structure would have white noise, and this structure would have no noise, because everything is regularly predicted. So brain can be considered a complex adaptive system because it fulfills the two criteria. Now, apart from the fact that complex adaptive systems are complex, which is what the word stands for, and adaptive, which means that they can adjust to the environment, they are also characterized by self-organization, meaning that there is no little homunculus sitting somewhere there who orchestrates everything, that there is self-similarity, which means that what happens in a single cell actually also can be similar to what happens in multiple cells and actually even at the brain level. And then the most important one for the talk today is emergence, which means that the whole is more than the sum of the components. For example, if you look at this is not a car. This is just a group of parts of a car. Now, it only becomes a car if all those pieces are put together in a very specific way, and then it becomes a car. And emergence arises when you connect parts, for example, parts of the brain in a very specific way. You just can't throw all the brain cells together and say, now we've got a brain. It doesn't mean anything. So what is important is that every different structure can have a different emergent characteristic. So if you have one structure of cells in the brain that are connected in one way, you might feel pain. Now, connected in a different way, then you've got another emergent characteristic, which could be the non-painful state, which is similar to the game that children play, the Transformer game, where with the same building blocks, you can get two completely emergent characteristics. So, which also means that you don't only look at brain activity differences when you look at different emergent properties, but sometimes it's just a different connectivity. And then when you do an fMRI scan, a classical fMRI scan, where you look at changes in Bolt signal and activity, you don't have to see a difference for a different emergent property to arise. Now, on the one hand, we know the brain is modular. There's certain parts of the brain that are involved in certain functions. So this part of the brain is involved in hearing, this part is the motor area, the sensory area, the visual area, and so on. On the other hand, I've been talking about networks. And the networks, and so how does that come together? Well, if you've got different parts of the brain, different modules, that they need to be connected, because when you look at me, you hear me, you see me, all at the same time. So this part of the brain that hears me and the other that sees me have to create a unified picture. Now, it is estimated, it's not 100% sure, but one of the most adapted ideas is that those different parts of the brain, that they work together at high frequencies, which could be beta or gamma, going from 20, actually from 13 all the way to 80 or 90 hertz, and that those modules are connected by low frequencies, which could be delta, theta, or alpha activity. Now, how does it connect them? Well, probably by nesting, which means that you've got a low frequency, just like a carrier wave on a radio, and on top of that carrier wave, the information is put in higher frequency, which could be beta and gamma. So then you get something like the images below here, where this is the carrier wave. That's the radio station you zoom into when you want to listen to certain music, and the information or the music itself is embedded in the higher frequencies, and it's important, and we'll get back to that later. Now, these networks are not all separate, and you can't separate them all. For example, if you look at the hippocampus, which is involved in storing things into memory, and you've got a certain network, which is here in red, that will represent Luke Skywalker. Now, another network will represent, what's he called, Yoda. And what is interesting is that Yoda is represented by two cells that are similar to Luke Skywalker. And when you have Darth Vader, he has another network, and he also has two cells that are linked to the other. So those networks are actually overlapping. Now, and you find the same thing in a self-similar way in the brain. So, for example, if you look at tinnitus, well, people will say, I hear a sound in my right ear, it's a pure tone, it affects my mood, it's very distressing, and so on and so forth. Well, all these different characteristics are represented most likely by different pathways, which are actually running at different frequencies, just like your radio station, which is good for a neurosurgeon, because it means that if you're going to target an area, for example, here the parahippocampal area, that you can try to be very frequency specific and not create collateral damage by influencing the other networks. So at least theoretically, it allows you to be very specific, which is important if you want to modulate a specific network of the brain. Now, complex adaptive systems are often open, which just means that they react with or interact with the environment. And of course, what our brain predominantly interacts with is information that comes from the environment. And that's where uncertainty is important, because ultimately we've got brains to reduce the inherent uncertainty in the environment. And the uncertainty is here not defined as in the quantum mechanical uncertainty. It's defined as where a representation of the world cannot be adapted as a guide for subsequent behavior or emotion or cognition. So basically, it just means there is not enough, I have not enough information to take on the next step. Well, if you don't have enough information, there's two ways in trying to solve it. You can get more information, either from the environment, and if the environment can't give it, because you, for example, auditory information can't gain access to your brain because you're deaf, for example, then there is only one other solution, as you go to memory, to what is lost stored in memory. Now, information is not easily understood, because information from an information theory point of view has two characteristics. One is the information content, what our brain is interested in, and the other is redundancy. Now, the information content is that which reduces the uncertainty. That's what our brain is really interested in. And the redundancy is actually very important, because it allows you to make mistakes and still get enough information to go on to the subsequent activity. So, for example, if you look at this sentence, it's exactly the same as the full sentence here. But you can leave out 10 letters in this part, and you will still understand the information content, whereas if you leave out 3 letters, you will not be able to understand the message. So we need this redundancy in order to be able to survive. So from a practical point of view, if you look at these MRI scans, this patient had a stroke in the brainstem and is in coma, but it's unilateral, which means that after 7 to 10 days, the patient will wake up, because there is a redundant system on the other side that allows the patient to wake up. Whereas on the other one, here, where you see the 2 little blue dots, even though it's very small, these are very symmetrical, very small lesions. This patient will never wake up from coma, because the redundant system is also being involved. Now, information itself is neither matter nor energy. It needs matter for embodiment. It needs a brain or a computer, and it needs energy for communication. If I don't get any energy, I won't be able to talk. If the computer doesn't get any energy, won't be able to function as well. Information has been called different things. It has been called the spirit, the ghost, and the machine, and so on and so forth. But if we go back to Plato and Aristotle, because that's where we started with as philosophers, actually the way they look at information, it just says you put a form onto something. And for Plato, there was an absolute form, and whatever we saw was kind of a copy of it. So you had the absolute model of a dog, and every dog was just a variation of that theme. Whereas Aristotle, like you see, didn't agree. He said, no, the form is actually the essential properties of a thing, which fits a little bit better with our idea that the form is actually the structure in a brain network. So, and then if you look at that from that point of view, then randomness is just a lack of form, a lack of pattern in the environment. Now, if we go one step further and we go to thermodynamics, then there is a second law of thermodynamics that says that everything goes to more chaos or more disorder. Now, an entropy can be seen as a measure of disorder, and if you look at it from an information point of view, you can look at it from missing information. So there is a lack of structure in the input. So bringing this to complex adaptive systems, that means why do we need this energy? Well, we need this energy for the brain to counter the disintegration of structural networks in our brain. And this is done predominantly by interactions of cells that are close together, which are nonlinear, which means that it can increase in the beginning and then decrease, for example, at the end. And it has a history, which means just there is memory, which allows you to make predictions. So if we put that together in a model of what the brain does, then what the brain does is it uses free energy. It uses energy, just glucose that it has, and oxygen, and in a kind of a random network, it uses this energy to create a transient structure with an emergent property. And that emergent property can be pain, that emergent property can be tinnitus. Now, it does so this structure is formed by the input of information which come from the environment, which ultimately reduces uncertainty into a transient certainty. I've got a certain I perceive something, so this means that transiently I have less uncertainty. Now, because of the second law of thermodynamics, that disappears, and the transient structure disappears, and with it, the percept, which is good, because if it wouldn't exist, we would only be able to have one percept in our own lives, and that was it. So the fact that it reduces actually allows us, for example, also to build scanners, because scanners are ultimately looking at this up and down going of the energy. Now, because the structure disappears, the transient structure with its emergent property disappears, also the transient uncertainty reduction disappears, and you have to go and get starting all over again. And this starting all over again is, for example, what the fMRI uses in its bold response. So we get a transient structure that disappears, and this transient structure is related to a percept which reduces the uncertainty. Now, the prediction is updated in a Bayesian way. This is not that important for now, but the concept will come back once we talk about dreams. So the information is linked to what is predicted, or the prior belief. And this is then updated with support of what you're sampling in the environment to support your prediction, and that will lead to the perception. So perception is basically a prediction associated with the support that you get in the environment for what you predicted, which means, as Rodolfo Lina said, that our default state is actually the dream state, and we just update it by what we find in the environment. And then what is next is that when it's updated, the posterior belief or the percept actually then becomes the new prediction of the next cycle. And that is why, if you've never seen this picture, you will have difficulty in recognizing a Dalmatian dog, whereas if you've always only seen it once, for those people it will be the prediction and you will recognize it immediately. Now, if you want to use this theory for practical purposes as a neurosurgeon or a neurologist or somebody interested in neuroscience, then we have to know how can we get to these predictions. And there is some interesting work done by Arnal in France where he suggests that the prediction itself is encoded with a specific oscillation frequency, which is the beta frequency, and the prediction error, which is what you want to update, is actually a combination of beta and gamma. And that's interesting because these are very strong predictions which we can use in order to see if this is correct. And so if we look, for example, at 153 tinnitus patients and 264 people without tinnitus, then we can look what is statistically different, and by that we can look at whether they indeed have a beta and a gamma correlation or not, which is what you will see in the green circles. Or you can do it even more, you can look at different brain areas that we know that are involved in tinnitus, and then specifically look in the green circles at those areas where you find this beta and gamma, which says that tinnitus is actually a prediction error. The brain says, well, I've always heard, let's say 4,000 hertz, you go to a disco and you damage your ear, you lose hearing at 4,000 hertz. Your brain says, well, I've always had 4,000 hertz coming in. Prediction is there should be 4,000 hertz. There is a large prediction error, which should be encoded, which should be which we should be able to visualize by looking at these frequencies, and that's what you're seeing here in this slide. So, why do we then develop these phantom percepts? Well, for an easy reason, because as I mentioned before, the brain cannot stand one thing, that's a lack of information. Because if it doesn't have any information, it goes and looks for information, and if there is not enough, it'll go to memory. So when there is sensory deafferentation, when your hand is amputated or your hearing is gone, then basically you can't fill in this missing information because it's not just there. So your brain go back to memory and pull out of memory the last stored feature, and that's going to be the phantom pain, like Captain Ahab in Moby Dick's book, or phantom sound, as Beethoven suffered when he turned deaf. But that is just when there is a deafferentation of sensory system, hearing loss, amputation. But if you deafferent yourself as a human being entirely from the surrounding, you will perceive something which is not there, and it might be another being, which could be God or Allah or Yahweh, depending on your cultural background. But that's not that important. What is interesting, if you now talk about dreams, then you deafferent yourself from the environment, but there is no updating possible. There is absolutely no updating because your sensory systems are down in dream state, and so what you will do is you will generate a self in an environment which is not updated, so you'll just float from one experience to the other experience. So, which is, as I mentioned before, the idea of Rodolfo Luna is that actually our normal default state is the dream state, and when we're awake, we just adjust the dream state to the environment. So if this is correct, when we're dreaming, actually, we don't get this Bayesian updating. We don't get this correction of the prediction. So a dream is a prediction without support of the stimulus, and in a dream state there is no tinnitus or no phantom pain. So can we use that in treatment? Well, yes, you can. You can try to remove the prediction altogether. And there is a recent experiment where they removed part of the cerebellum, the paraflocculus, in animals who had tinnitus, and their tinnitus, their behaviorally disappeared. Or when they were exposed to a loud sound, they did not develop tinnitus. So probably, or potentially, one of the hypotheses is that actually you just remove the prediction. And if you remove the prediction, there won't be a prediction error. And if there's no prediction error, there won't be tinnitus, there won't be phantom pain. Or you can remove the updating of the prediction error, which is what I'm predominantly interested in. Or you can provide false support. So you can try to trick the brain and say, well, your prediction is there should be, for example, 2 legs in an amputated person, like here. And then you trick the brain by looking at a mirror where you see a fake leg which is not there, and the phantom pain in about 50 to 60% of the patient disappears. So you can trick the brain in believing that there is supporting evidence for the prediction. But ultimately what we need is we need a better understanding of this Bayesian network in the brain, and this is what I'm hoping, that's the dream, that's the visionary dream of me here in New Zealand, is hoping to unravel the system, because if we unravel the system, we will be able to treat phantoms a lot better. So, in conclusion, tinnitus is not only an ear problem, it's probably generated more centrally, and sometimes it can be managed by controlling the brain if we understand it well enough. And as we started, Martin Luther King said, I have a dream one day that according to Nietzsche, they will wake up and take note that their ears were dreaming. So, as a last slide, I think the best way to get started is to quit talking and to start doing something. And I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dirk. My name is John McCall, and I'm standing in tonight for Professor Andre Van Rij, who's overseas. And it's my pleasure, on behalf of the Department of Surgical Sciences, to thank you for your lecture tonight. According to one of the slides you showed, I've lost 85,000 neurons during your lecture, so I'm very glad that I brought my notes. Professor Reid has already told us something about Dirk's background, and of course we count ourselves as being tremendously lucky to have attracted a person of Dirk's calibre to Dunedin to be the academic head of the first, and at this point in time at least, the only academic neurosurgical unit in New Zealand. And now that those of you who haven't heard Dirk speak before have now had a first-hand glimpse into some of his work and some of his thinking. And one of the things that his lecture illustrates to me, and I have had the chance to hear Dirk talk before on several occasions, is that Dirk is not just a neurosurgeon, but he's also a neuroscientist. And it's a very common conception, I think, that surgeons in particular are people who do things, they're doers. And of course doing things is essential to the art of surgery. But I think what Dirk epitomises, and we saw this in his lecture, that the role of the academic surgeon is much more than this, is also to think and to communicate and to enhance understanding. And I think that we saw all of those characteristics demonstrated tonight. And you'll also note from the content of the lecture, and if you go to the Dunedin School of Medicine's website and look up Dirk's research profile, you'll see that he's not at all constrained by traditional surgical boundaries. His research draws on many other disciplines, including pain medicine, neurology, psychiatry, psychology, and even philosophy and religion. And tonight what we heard about was work that explores the way we perceive ourselves and also the way in which the world, we perceive the world around us. And what happens when those perceptions become distorted or disordered, and how they affect our quality of life and our ability to function as human beings. Now, importantly, from a therapeutic point of view, we also heard about how those distorted perceptions may be modulated so that we can restore equilibrium and enable us to function better. I found that some of the stuff actually I had trouble following, and I look forward to actually hearing you again for a third or a fourth time, Dirk, so that I can pick up the thread of some of these exciting concepts. But in particular, I was drawn to the idea of the duality of dreams. And on the one hand, Dirk, you spoke about dreams in aspirational terms and cited a well-known example of Martin Luther King. And knowing a little bit about what you were talking about tonight, I thought of a much more prosaic and immediate aspiration that could be closer to home and probably close to the bone. The dream of winning back the America's Cup. And I think that Grant Dalton and Dean Barker will be feeling more than phantom pain if they don't pull something out of the bag tomorrow. Dirk, you also spoke of harnessing the dream state as a therapeutic tool. Perhaps this isn't a new concept, and I'm sure that the founders of psychoanalysis, Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung and others, had similar precepts, but I think that they would have been blown away by your explanations of the neurobiological mechanisms that we heard about tonight. You also talked about the visionary aspect of dreams, and tonight also represents the realization of another vision, and that is the retention of neurosurgical services in Otago and Southland. And Professor Hayne also touched on this. And I think it's worth reflecting on the reasons that that's come about. And it came about really because the District Health Board and the university and the community all stood together and they spoke with one voice, with unity. And so I think that neurosurgery can be an exemplar of what we can achieve if we have a unity of purpose. Now, there were many people involved in the neurosurgery campaign, and I just wanted to mention two names. Many of those people will be here tonight. One is Brigadier Brian McMahon, who chaired the fundraising committee for the Neurological Foundation Chair of Neurosurgery, and that's the chair that Professor De Ridder has been appointed to, so it seems fitting to acknowledge Brian tonight. And the other person is Sam Bashara, whose absolute dedication over a long period, both before and long after his official retirement, kept the neurosurgery flame alive in Dunedin. However, tonight belongs to Professor Dirk De Ridder, and Dirk, we are absolutely delighted to have you here in Dunedin. I want to congratulate you on a wonderful lecture, and I'd also like you to accept this token on behalf of everybody here.